Good morning. My name is Stacey Croft. I'm one of the pastors here. It's good to see all of you. Welcome if you're visiting, and welcome back if you're a member here or attend here regularly. Love to get to know you at some point and hear your story and help you plug further into the life of what's going on at Christ the King. One thing that I enjoy, especially now living in a city where it's a little more commute oriented, even like the small commutes. I love podcasts. I don't know if you're a podcast person. Most of us probably are. Books on, audiobooks or podcasts kind of thing. But the thing I love about a good podcast is you just get to hear different people and different, kind of one-off perspectives. Particularly there's one, and from time to time, people give me some good suggestions. One that I'll listen to is called How I Built This. It's actually a podcast on certain industries and founders of them and people who've kind of built things up, companies up from the ground up. Very fascinating, interesting hearing about their lives, how they built their company, where it is now. They've even had people like Dude Perfect on there and, people like it just kind of spread. The spectrum is pretty far and wide. One of them I remember particularly because I worked there, or I officed out of there, was WeWork. I don't know if you remember WeWork, or some of you may work in WeWork. WeWork is interesting. There's actually a podcast and a documentary on it called We Crashed, which I worked there actually through the COVID time, so I joked that it was We Sick. But it was an interesting place to work because if you watch the documentary or you listen to the podcast, it tells you about the idea behind what he was wanting to do. He and his wife actually was drawn out of a kibbutz in Israel and wanting to create community, deep, profound community. And, if you've ever worked in those common spaces like that, this one was pretty intense. I remember sitting in my office and they'd push a cart by and it was like, it's happy time. And it's like, throwing candy on my desk. And I was like, I'm not happy right now. But I'll come back later. But it's interesting to hear about those kind of things. When you ask the question, especially when we're sitting in a church, you can ask a very similar question. How's the church built? And for many of us, there are a lot of, and if you think about it, there are a lot of commonalities, a lot of ways the church has been built, and with also the different joys, struggles, successes, difficulties, common issues, whatever it may be. And there's a lot of those things that we could look at. Some of us have come from other churches. Some of us have been here for years and seen it in different iterations and times. But you know what's different? It's interesting when you step back and look at what the church is that no matter what has come against it, no matter how it changes or whatever happens in it, it is supernaturally upheld. And because of that, no matter what happens in it, it will never go away. In fact, if you look at the very first church in the Bible, the way it was thriving in the culture, in the surrounding world, wasn't because of its successes, it was because of its suffering. It was because it's built supernaturally and different than anything else. Though it may have people who are a part of this world and a part of everything else, it is built differently, and we, as those who are called to it, are built differently. In fact, when Peter wrote this letter, and we've been taking some time to look in the book of Acts, and actually, ironically, been looking at Peter speaking. Peter in Acts, in those narrative accounts, wrote letters, and he wrote letters 1st and 2nd Peter, and we actually are diving back into those letters now, which is kind of cool, was to see the life of Peter and now the letters of Peter. And where he goes with this today in 1 Peter chapter 2 is to talk about how the church is made. How's it built? How's it structured? If you're an engineer here, you're going to love this one, okay? It's right up your alley. Architects, engineers, this is your thing. But he's very overt about the fact that the church is supernaturally built not on just ideologies, but on a person, transforms the way we are built as the church together. And so we're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 2, and we're going to look at verses 4 through 10. And this is on page 1014 in your black Bibles. By the way, if you need a Bible, please feel free to take that one. That is for you. And some of you, I'm thankful to hear, have actually taken those. If you haven't had a Bible yourself, please take that. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 10. As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves are living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We're going to look at this passage in two parts. One, we're going to look at the stone or the cornerstone. What is the stone? And two, what is the spiritual house? And how are we that spiritual house? So the stone and the spiritual house. You know, if you were to walk around downtown Houston, many of you work down there, so you've probably seen this or just a part of it, or maybe you've just passed right by it. But in many of the buildings, you can see on the edges, there may be a stone or something that looks somewhat out of place. And it may be discolored or a different kind of stone that's stuck on the end of a lot of the buildings. And it has usually maybe a date or a time in it. And that is typically referred to as the cornerstone. Now we, in our architectural time, kind of stick those on the side, but there are actually some ancient ones that are used specifically for the purpose of architecture. Some even go back to 1866 for the Antioch Baptist Church that's close to downtown. They have an original cornerstone on that thing. And also for the Houston courthouse, 1938, there's actually a cornerstone that has a time capsule in it with items from 1937. Which is beautiful. And so even that's a newer, older one because that's another iteration of that building. You can see those. What was the cornerstone? Why that? Ancient architects and masons would actually go into a quarry and they would begin digging through the rock. And what they were looking for typically is to find a stone that could do two things. One, hold the weight of what would be built on top of it, and two, set the lines and the course of what they were building from it. So when they would dig through, they would find just the right one that could hold both those things. So when it says the cornerstone here about a living stone, you come to him, a living stone, and later on Isaiah 28, the cornerstone, this is Jesus. It's talking about there is one who is. And it begins in verse 4 by saying, as you come to him. I love how it just invites us. As you come to him. And it sets the lines of this building differently than any other. Because most buildings, whether it's a religion, philosophy, idea, or any other construction, does so based on some sort of teaching. It's done so based on some sort of philosophy that gets you going through the day. It may be something in your life. Maybe you have something that you have kind of built your life upon in that way. Here's what's unique about this. It doesn't say, as you come to his teaching. It says, as you come to him. The cornerstone is a person. And it makes the building, the foundation of the church, unique. It makes it completely different, actually, than anything else, because it helps the continued stability of this foundation. It's not based on something else. It's interesting, even in Roman times, or when Peter might be writing this, you didn't have people coming along saying, I'm a Zeusian, They didn't follow certain gods the way that people would talk about being a Christ follower. And so to say this, to put Jesus forward as the one who you come to him, and it says a living stone, a foundation. It's a very different foundation because he is a living stone. Not only did he live then, he currently lives now. And it shows the fact that the founder is different. I don't know if you watched when Queen Elizabeth passed some time ago and we got to see King Charles come in. It was fascinating. I always appreciate and really get into that kind of royalty and that regal work in the UK, because you get a sense of tradition and ancient tradition of passing down of the throne and kingship. And it's interesting because of that line of what's passed down, that continued question of who's the one next in line. The church is built differently than that. As much as it's interesting, even the UK says, and even in its tradition, the royalty of the UK, anywhere it goes, it touches, that's the royalty of the UK. But the church is built differently because its founder didn't die and pass along the church. He died and rose again in order to remain the cornerstone and then continue that foundation. That's why it's interesting when Matthew 16, Mark 8, these kind of passages happen, like kind of in the middle of each of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke particularly, and you recall this moment, this narrative moment where Peter and the other disciples are with Jesus, and Jesus has this, it's kind of wild. He says to them, he goes, hey, who do people say that I am? Like, what do they think of me? And they go, well, they think you're like Elijah or John the Baptist or somebody coming back, or one of the prophets. And he goes, okay, that's kind of cool. What do you think? Who do you think that I am? And it puts them on the spot. And if you really think about what Jesus is doing to them in that moment, he's putting them in the position to really ask, who is it? Are they just following another person? Because throughout his ministry, you see him constantly correcting them about that. They're like, can we sit at your left and right hand? Can we do that? And he's like, well, I don't think you really understand what you're asking. He keeps continually teaching them, what is the foundation? Who is he? And he says to them, Peter goes, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He says, you are correct. And Peter, on this rock, I will build my church. Now, I want us to pause for a moment. And I had a great question after the first service asking this question. It should ring in our minds. Is Peter the rock? He is one of them. But there's a Greek nuance between Peter's name and rock. And he's speaking to Peter, but all the other disciples who would be apostles, who would be a part of that rock where Jesus is the cornerstone leading out from, that the church is built upon. And what he says right after that, and he says, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. If you want to know, does any other organization or structure have anything like that come against it and prevail? Now notice, Jesus doesn't say the gates of hell, won't come against. He says it will come against it, but it will prevail. You see the difference? The gates of hell are trying to come against it, but the church will prevail. How in the world can the church do that? It can only do it if it is set with the correct foundation. And for many of us, it should expose what we think the foundation of the church is. I mean, the gates of hell prevail against so many institutions. How does it not here? And for many of us, this should encourage us where we come into a place like this, and I will raise my hand as one included, with many facets where we see or have been burned or bored or cynical about what the church is or has been to us. Because what it does is it should drive us back to what is the foundation of it. And it exposes to me what we can often make the foundation of the church. Often can. I remember in college, man, I lived in a house and we had a pig, and that's a story for another day. But Pearl, the pig, one day when I was home studying, had gotten under the house. And I was like, oh man, I was home alone. The guy who actually bought Pearl and had this pig in the backyard was not home. Great roommate, but I'm like, dude, what do I do with a pig? I'm not from pig world. You buy pigs. I go outside. I'm like, okay, Pearl is under the house somewhere. I bend down and look into this little hole where obviously Pearl had gone under. And there the light kind of comes in. And I realized that our entire back bathroom is held up by a log. Someone had just gone and popped this thing right under it. No cinder block, no bricks. That's why I wonder, like, when I was walking in, I was like going to the bathroom this way. I was walking to the restroom. Like, there's no level floor. It is interesting. What would happen when you come against, when you see, and this is what Peter's getting at here, when it says, behold, I'm laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious. He's quoting from Isaiah, and he's quoting where princes had enemies who were coming against them, and they thought they could stand on their own. He's saying, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious. He uses two words to talk about this is specific and incredibly valuable. And whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. Both now and forever is what that Greek is speaking of. Not just shame in the moment, but forever. When you actually come to Jesus, the cornerstone, he will expose your foundation. And it should offend us at times. I was speaking to a group a couple weeks ago about that. That there are moments, and it even speaks of this, that the rock, the stone of stumbling, rock of offense in verse 8, we don't think of Jesus as offensive. But if we come to a service and actually hear the good news, it should be offensive in a sense to every foundation we want to build up other than him. I mean, think about Peter and the rock. On this rock I'll build. Guess what happened after that? Peter's like, Jesus starts talking about the cross and where this foundation is going. And he says, are you crazy? Like, why would you do that? Execution, death, that's not what we did not sign up for this regime. That's not what we're wanting. And he says, get behind me, Satan. He uses some of the most strong language you could use to the person which he just said, confessed who he is. Why? Because he stumbled. Not stumbled in the terms of being lost, but stumbled because it wasn't based on what he wanted. It's based on who he is. And hear this, if it's based on what we want from him, it will fall. It will always fall. But if it is based on whom he is, his character as the cornerstone, it will shape everything. And that's the point, is as far as the cornerstone, so goes the house. The stone shapes the house. That's why he says that as a living stone rejected by men in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves are like living stones being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. What I pray, and I think Peter hopes that we hear from this, is that wherever we are in the spectrum of understanding what the church is that we cannot be alone in it. That God has called you into it in a different way, not through your resume like any other institution, not through what you can bring into it. And you may even be here going, why am I still in it? And the way that our hearts are changed and transformed into that spiritual house is by being reminded that our founder, our foundation, our cornerstone is a living stone that brings together living stones. And what unites us into biological architecture, if you want to call it that, is the Holy Spirit himself. What bonds the church together is not plaster, it's not walls, it's not anything else, but we can meet anywhere we want, and what makes us is the Holy Spirit. The third person of the Trinity is put into us. And he says, you are a spiritual house. That means we're the temple. And I'll tell you, as a Christian, I've been a Christian for years. I've been in ministry for years. And I think the thing that still overwhelms me is God dwells in us. I still can't get over the fact that God, like I know we sing it at Christmas, God with us. And we sing Christmas songs that talk about it. But if you sit here for a moment, and I love that Paul played for a little bit. It forces us to just not look at something and think and meditate on what are we doing. If we confess and think about what we're doing in this room, that God would actually choose to dwell with us, that's incredibly overwhelming. But that's the temple. The finite meets the infinite, and the sinful meets the holy. And God comes into that. That's where he wants to be. So set yourself in the position of these hearers for a moment. These people listening to Peter are people going, okay, am I really worth it? They were in a moment of time asking the question as deeply suffering, oppressed. People around them thought they were a nuisance. The government around them thought that they shouldn't exist. How do we see ourselves as the architecture that God has taken outcasts and brought us in to make us the church, that he brings people together that would look at one another and go, man, how are we meeting together and worship? There's nothing else like it. I remember I was backpacking years ago in Italy. I got to go to Venice. And I don't know if you've ever been to Venice, or maybe you've seen this on a movie or a TV show. They show this all the time. It's the Piazza San Marco. It's that beautiful piazza that's like right next to the water, has the pillars and the church. And you always see those scenes of like people running through it. I don't know why, but it's like, let's run through it. Pigeons everywhere. And it's called the Piazza San Marco because the church is the St. Mark's, the church. And if you go to visit that church and walk in, you first, you feel the ground under you, just kind of like what you would think in Venice. The foundation is shifty because of the water and low level. But if you look around, it is the weirdest looking place you've ever seen. Nothing matches. Nothing looks right. Everything is out of place. And if you look at, like, it'd be like if we were decided to decorate a church and we were like, let's put in 10 different lights. And then let's put those speakers like there and those like here. And then move this around. Like literally nothing looks right. Everything's out of place. And I remember like reading up on it and going, what is wrong with this church? And it says the church is built and then completely done and like designed and decorated from stolen goods by merchants. So you have like the oddest things you've ever seen. You're like, why is that there? And yet that's the church. That is exactly what is being built up. Stones don't have a choice to look at one another and say, I don't want to be next to you. They're built up. And who builds them? The Lord. I think it's amazing. It says you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. A chosen race. I mean, in this time period, in this place, a chosen race was a mix of people together. And what was the race that they were? It was Christian. It wasn't you are black, white, Think about how many over the years, over decades, millennia, centuries, how many people have not felt like a chosen race? And for these people to hear they are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, they represent the king. They are those representatives. And they are a holy nation. They're holy priesthood. Typically when we think of holy, we think of things that are avoidant. We think of like the cultural sense of holiness, not the biblical sense. The cultural sense of holiness for us is that it's so set apart that, the holier than thou, that's why we use that language. But actually, what he's saying about a holy priesthood isn't a defensive posture or an avoidant posture. It's actually an active and it's an addressing posture. It's actively applying who we are. It means that you and I are a holy priesthood, not just me because I have this on. We are a holy priesthood because we represent a God who is the cornerstone, not ourselves. And it doesn't mean spiritual expertise. And it doesn't mean you've done all the right things. It means this. And I love what John Owen, I'm just going to quote somebody who I think said it better than I did. He's a Puritan theologian who said this. Holiness is nothing but the implanting, writing, and realizing of the gospel in our souls. Hear this again. Holiness is nothing but the implanting, writing, and realizing of the gospel in our souls. So if we're offering these sacrifices, it's us living out what the sacrifice of Christ is. It's people around us experiencing, yes, holiness does express and show sin and the difference between sin and what it is. But what is a priest? A priest is somebody who comes across. A priest is somebody who knows their own sin and knows they need sacrifice, and yet they're giving it. They're pointing to Christ. They're pointing to the ultimate sacrifice. It comes across the excellency. Notice, even it says, if we are a people of his own possession, verse 9, that we proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. What are we supposed to be speaking to people? The excellencies of him. Do you know the Greek for excellencies is the heroic? It means almost like we're reading, please tell me you've read this, and if you haven't, I'm going to buy you one. It's the Sally Lloyd-Jones Jesus Storybook Bible. And you know what she says over and over in there? She took this and played with it and put it all the way through from beginning to end. About the hero, the rescuer. Who is it? It's Jesus. That's what we proclaim. That's who we are. That's what we do out of darkness into his marvelous light. That's what we show. And we increasingly show this. Ed Clowney, who I think John quoted him a couple weeks ago. He used to serve on staff here. Actually, I was on staff here when he was on staff here. It's kind of funny. And he would come interrupt me when I was on a phone call and want to share a Coke every now and then. This great theologian guy. And I didn't know, I was this young youth director. And he would just sit and wait for me to get off the phone. And then he'd just be like, here, you want to split a Coke? I'm like, should I hang up or what are we doing here? I guess so. He said this about the church. I love it. He said, increasingly, the ordered fellowship of the church becomes the sign of grace for the warring factions of a disordered world. Increasingly, the ordered fellowship of the church becomes the sign of grace for the warring factions of a disordered world. That's what living stones show. It doesn't mean we're perfect. It doesn't mean we don't have friction. That's what stones do. They rub against each other, and sometimes it's painful. And we got to work through that, wherever we are in this room. But it means we begin with a different cornerstone. You know, this table speaks volumes of what this passage is about. This table says everything about verse 10, which is such a great summary of everything. If you want a summary verse from this, it says this: once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. This table is everything about that. This is not my table. This is not Christ the King's table. This is Jesus' table. And what's beautiful about that is it actually says even there again, as you come to him, it's an invitation to you to come to him. Come to him by faith, trust in him, believe in him. And if you haven't, if you're here and you're like, man, this is interesting to think about how the church is built, but I'm not there yet. I don't know if I really follow him or would consider myself a Christ follower. I'd encourage you not to take at this table, because you don't want to say that you believe something when you don't. That'd be disingenuous, right? Come forward, fold your hands, receive a benediction. Let's talk. Let's think further on, is this something like every day, or is this something supernatural that the Lord has put together? That none of us would be in this room other than by his hand. And if you're here and you would say, I'm a follower of Jesus, come remembering. This is what you think. You know what you want to think about when you come take communion? You're always like, what do I think about when I take communion? Think, once I wasn't, and now I am. Once I didn't have mercy, but now I do. Praise be to God for his mercy.